Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Hello, and welcome to today's event all about building city business collaborations for climate success. My name is Kira Appleby, and I'm CDP's Global Director for City, States, and Regions, and I'll be chairing today's webinar. Thank you very much to our hosts, UN Habitat, the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, and the IPCC. During this webinar, we'll be discussing the critical role of collaboration between cities and businesses in the fight against climate change. Worldwide, cities account for more than 70% of global emissions, 70% of global GDP, and they're home to 55% of the world's population. However, many cities directly control just 4% of the emissions within their city, with the remainder being under the control of other actors, including businesses. CDP has the world's largest environmental disclosure platform and the most comprehensive data set on emissions and climate plans of global cities and businesses. This past year, over 10,000 businesses and 1,000 cities reported to CDP. One of our most recent findings, 75% of global cities that disclosed to us this year revealed that they currently do or plan to collaborate with businesses on sustainability projects. This has perfectly positioned us to facilitate collaboration between city governments and businesses. And this is why we've partnered with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and C40 to deliver the City Business Climate Alliance initiative. And I'm joined by colleagues from CDP and WBCSD to tell us more about this project a little later. We're also very fortunate to have two wonderful cities at different stages of city business collaboration, including the fully operational partnership that is the Boston Green Ribbon Commission and the City of Dallas, who recently launched their City Business Climate Alliance initiative. We're also joined by the global architecture firm Gensler, who will be sharing their experience with and perspective on collaborations with cities from a business perspective. And lastly, we'll finish up with a question and answer session with the speakers. So please put any questions that you have into the question and answer or chat box. Now, before I introduce our panelists, I'm very pleased to tell you that we are joined by David Miller. David is the Managing Director of International Diplomacy at C40 and the former Mayor of Toronto. During his time as Mayor of Toronto, David served as C40 Chair from 2008 to 2010, strengthening the network and putting cities on the global stage for their climate leadership. As chair, Toronto became a city widely admired internationally for its environmental programs, economic strength, and social integration. We're delighted to have David with us here today to share his wisdom and to tell us why city business collaboration is so important. David, over to you.
Thanks very much, Kira, and thank you to CDP and the World Business Council on Social Development for this very important partnership. And I particularly want to acknowledge CDP's leadership in providing a platform for people to know what is really happening in carbon reduction. Without CDP, that wouldn't be possible. So thank you for all of your ongoing work. And thank you, everyone, for being with us today. C40 is proud to be one of the founding partners of the City Business Climate Alliance and to be a part of the Innovate for Cities conference today. For those of you who don't know, C40 is a global network of almost 100 of the world's greatest cities working to reduce emissions, increase resilience, and improve equity. C40 was founded in 2005 by then Mayor Ken Livingstone of London, England, whose founding idea, and it's still the heart of our work today, is that the actions and the voices of the mayors of the world's leading cities could help the world avoid dangerous climate change. So our overarching goal is to help the world avoid catastrophic climate change, not just our member cities, by delivering resilient and inclusive climate action, which limits global heating to 1.5 degrees, the so-called higher ambition of the Paris Agreement. This means our cities need to collectively deliver their fair share of a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030 and become net zero by 2050. C40's aim, though, is not just for its member cities to demonstrate what meeting science-based climate targets looks like, but to support mayors to form the necessary coalitions for action with partners from business, labor, the youth movement, and civil society. We also seek to inspire others, at least another 1,000 cities beyond our membership, to commit to the same ambition and levels of action. The power of such alliances can influence the narrative around climate change, change public opinion, shift markets, and shape national policies and international climate talks, ultimately driving further ambition and, most importantly, action. We're already seeing that as the impacts of climate change have begun to deepen social inequalities across the world, cities and businesses are increasingly realizing the importance of climate change adaptation as well as emissions reductions. According to CDP, 399 cities, and we'll get it to 400 by the end of this meeting, I'm sure, now have climate action plans, twice as many as in 2016, and 459 cities have an adaptation plan that identifies and manages climate risks. And that's up from just 30 10 years ago. Meanwhile, 40% of the 400 biggest global corporations have now set an emissions goal and are taking steps to ensure that sustainability is at the heart of their business plans. While many cities and businesses already have ambitious climate action and sustainability plans, C40 research from 2016 showed that one of the main barriers to unlocking climate action in cities was establishing an effective working relationship between the city government and the mayor with the private sector and encouraging the growth of green businesses. It's clear there's an urgent need to harness the momentum on both sides and address the lack of coordinated city business collaboration by building trust between the key city and business stakeholders in cities across the world. City business partnerships have huge potential to reduce emissions on a greater scale than the city or individual businesses could manage alone, by maximizing the assets of each actor and implementing the ambitious, coordinated local climate action that is needed to create inclusive, prosperous, and most of all, climate-safe cities. Many cities in the City Business Climate Alliance Network are already making great strides to collaborate with businesses on climate action. For example, in Stockholm, the city launched the Stockholm Climate Pact in 2007, a network between the City of Stockholm, businesses, and organizations with the purpose to gather forces and exchange ideas and experiences to help Stockholm reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The group is coordinated by the Vice Mayor Katarina Löhr and has 330 business members. The group also recently launched Climate Pact Delivers, a CBCA-supported group including the city and 10 businesses focusing on freight and transport logistics. And by the way, that's a lesson that can spread globally that we can all learn from Stockholm about the importance of freight and transport logistics in reducing climate impact. In Vancouver, the city and the Vancouver Economic Commission have been engaging businesses in the development of their zero-emission transition action plan. In Lisbon, the city has launched Compromisso Verde, a green pact to foster local business climate action. Historically, the City of Toronto partnered with businesses in the development industry and the local gas company and building owners in the commercial sector in downtown to form the Better Buildings Partnership to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase energy efficiency from commercial buildings. And that's an example of how city-based climate action and the ideas behind it can spread. The City of Melbourne heard about this initiative, started its own Better Buildings partnership, and then Sydney copied them as well. Certainly a hope from C40's perspective that we can learn from each other, take the best ideas, and duplicate them globally to ensure that we have rapid climate action. As the C40 Global Mayors COVID Recovery Task Force set out last year, the most immediate test of any leader's commitment to climate action is to ensure that the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic is green and just. Investing in a green and just recovery will also create more good jobs and better protect people's health than attempting to return to business as usual. To achieve this, it's important that cities are engaging with businesses to understand their workers' needs and the type of support they need to recover and boost the local green economy. In San Francisco, Mayor Breed launched a climate smart recovery initiative to help San Francisco and the local business community leverage their collective leadership and expertise to build back better together. The San Francisco Business Council on Climate Change, BC3, a CBCA fellow, is working with the city to identify climate smart recovery opportunities and to look at the impacts and opportunities of remote working, changing transportation needs, and workforce shifts on the local economy and infrastructure. As we go forward together, building coalitions between cities and businesses will become increasingly important to tackle the climate emergency and ensure a just transition to a greener and fairer economy. Creating green jobs, a clean electricity grid, retrofitting buildings or electrifying vehicle fleets in cities will take a collaborative effort between both public and private partners. It's clear that if replicated at pace and scale, the actions of some of these leading CBCA cities and their business leadership groups can point the way to all of us to creating a more sustainable planet and hopefully get the world on track to have emissions by 2030, which we must if we're going to do what science tells us is necessary. I look forward to the presentations today, and even more importantly, to building ongoing collaborations to ensure we achieve those goals. Kira, thanks so much for the gracious introduction again. I look forward to today's conversation, and I'll pass the floor back to you.
Thank you very much, David. It's great to hear about the focus on collaboration. We've been saying this has to be the decade, not just of action, but the decade of radical collaboration if we're to achieve the emissions reductions and an equitable future that we all want. So now I'm going to pass to Ravina Singh from CDP and Claudia Schweitzer from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development to give us a little bit more information about the City Business Climate Alliance.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kira. Hi, everyone. And just as Kira said, my name is Ravina Singh, and I am a Senior Project Officer at CDP, where I specifically focus on the City Business Climate Alliance, or CBCA for short. So, to the challenge we're tackling and why the City Business Climate Alliance was set up. So cities, as we've just heard, cities account for more than 70% of the world's CO2 emissions, but they don't control over 80% of their emissions, highlighting why collaboration is so key. And on the flip side of this, CDP's latest report, Working Together to Beat the Climate Crisis, revealed that 75% of cities are already or intend to collaborate with businesses within the next 2 years. However, we are not yet on track to reduce emissions in line with a 1.5-degree pathway, and barriers to collaboration still exist. And it's these barriers we're trying to remove through CBCA. So, what is CBCA? As the name suggests, it is an alliance between C40, a network of almost 100 of the world's most ambitious cities, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which is a CEO-led organization of over 200 leading businesses and hosts a network of around 70 national business councils, and CDP, where we work with over 10,000 cities, states and regions, businesses and investors to disclose key environmental data and drive ambitious climate action. And by combining our strengths, it's made CBCA a very powerful partnership. And there are two tiers to the project. Firstly, at the local level, where we build city business partnerships that drive accelerated climate action. And secondly, at the global level, where we've set up a network where cities can learn from each other through knowledge sharing. So the CBCA network is made up of 19 cities all across the world, as you can see on this map here. And we have 8 cohort cities who receive hands-on support from us to set up or develop their city business partnerships. And you're going to be able to hear directly from one of our fantastic cohort cities, Dallas, later on in today's session. And we have 4 fellow cities who have already established their city business partnerships and very kindly share their knowledge with cities earlier on in the journey. And we have the Boston Green Ribbon Commission here with us today, who will tell you all about their partnership in a little while. And finally, we have 7 network cities who are slightly less advanced in setting up their partnerships, but who still get to learn from the other cities in the CBCA network. So for a brief overview of what the partnerships look like, so they are underpinned by cities' climate action plans and aim to accelerate action in line with these plans by driving engagement and collaboration between cities and businesses in a long-term sustainable way. And this allows cities and businesses to co-create emission reduction projects in a non-commercial space. Now that's it from me. I'm now going to hand over to Claudia.
Yes, hello everyone, and I'm Claudia Schweitzer. I'm Sustainable Cities Manager from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which acronyms is WBCSD. So with CBCA, we have been drawing a lot of inspiration from the work that CDP, C40, and the B team has been doing with London in the London Business Climate Leaders Initiative, and that has set up a group of businesses that have committed to take actions in different areas. We also reviewed a number of city business partnerships worldwide, about 30 together with C40. And we continuously learning from the CBCA fellows that Ravina has introduced before. And those fellows have set up their own city business platforms, and they're kindly sharing with us their experience. So the London Helsinki Metropolitan Smart and Clean Foundation that has established to operate for 5 years and just ended in June this year. They work on new types of mobility, housing, and circular economy solutions to mitigate climate change. The Boston Green Ribbon Commission, you will hear more about it with John Cleveland, who is going to present you that commission in details. In San Francisco, the Business Council on Climate Change, as mentioned by David Miller. We have a membership-driven initiative here, joined by 100 forward-thinking businesses and partners in the Bay Area to share best practices. Next slide, please. So working in a collaborative way has many benefits, and the cities that are working with us are starting to understand it as well, and many others have done that. So we see that for cities, they have access to business expertise and the research that they're doing as well as the implementation capacity. There are many businesses with a great expertise across cities, but some are setting ambitious emission targets, but are not always involved in a formal way. So this is also a way that they can deliver against a common target, working together. It is also giving an opportunity to explore new forms of urban governance and new partnership models with a wider group of stakeholders in the city. And on the side of the businesses, the benefits with this type of platforms are giving them a direct access to cities and decision makers so that they can really share the constraints, the barriers they are meeting, and also the resources that they have to develop projects. They can showcase their leadership and strengthen the business value for sustainability with new opportunities and business models. They can also join forces, working together with many other industries and raise standards, practices. They can also influence policies and overcome shared challenges that they have. So for both businesses and cities, it's an opportunity to better understand at a greater level the city environmental impact by quantifying businesses' performance through monitoring. Next slide, please. So what we have achieved since we have started CBCA, we give support to 8 cohort cities that you have seen on the map before, involve 7 network cities and 4 fellow cities. We run knowledge sharing webinars on different topics covering business engagement. We also started with sectoral webinars and had one on mobility a month ago. We developed a dedicated website. We have also a knowledge hub shared on C40 Knowledge Hub. And we have a newsletter, and we participate to global events like this one today. On the local partnership side, we run alignment workshop with cohort cities and their local businesses. We delivered business cards to identify which other businesses the city should work with, or that they haven't thought about how well they are scoring as well. And we have launched the first city business partnership in Stockholm that David Miller has just mentioned before. Next slide, please. So I just don't want to repeat. This is just the 10 local companies that have committed to reduce emissions from deliveries and logistics. And they have made some commitments to implement, share results, and participate in workshops that the Climate Pact has put in place, which is the business platform of Stockholm. They have a very direct dialogue with the Vice Mayor, Katarina Löhr, which helps her also to understand and advance this topic. Thank you. And the next slide. This is our contacts, the link to our website, and also if you want to scan the QR code to subscribe to our newsletter.
Thanks, Kira. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Claudia and Ravina. So I'm now very pleased to introduce John Cleveland, who's the Executive Director from the Boston Green Ribbon Commission.
Great, thanks, Kira. It's delightful to be here and to be sharing our experience and learning from the other members in this network. This network's been really valuable to us. It's really informed sort of a lot of our thinking about sort of where we might go next. So I just want to give you a quick overview on the Green Ribbon Commission, where we came from, how we're structured, and a couple of the successes that we have had and sort of where we're going forward. So if you could move it to the next slide. So our mission is to accelerate the implementation of the City of Boston's Climate Action Plan by convening, organizing, and enabling leadings from Boston's key sectors. Now, the term commission is a little misleading because this is a totally volunteer CEO network. It's not a unit of city government, and it's not established with any executive orders or anything like that. We currently have 36 members. They represent primarily the large property owner sectors in the city of Boston. We've done just sort of a back of the envelope analysis. The organizations that sit on the Green Ribbon Commission control about 10% of the total square footage in the city. We have a very close relationship with the city, and we think about the city as our customer for this work. Every mayor, since when we were established in 2010, has agreed to co-chair, be a co-chair of the commission. So that relationship is very important. And just quickly sort of where the GRC came from. We were established in 2010, and it really came out of two events that simultaneously happened in 2009. And one was the city of Boston developing its first really serious climate action plan. They had a citizen commission and a task force and a whole bunch of engagement processes around that. And then at the same time, our local largest independent foundation, the Barr Foundation, made a commitment to put $10 million a year for 5 years into climate action in a combination of Boston, Massachusetts, and New England. And the head of the Barr Foundation, Amos Hofstadter, and then Mayor Menino, were having a conversation about this sort of synchronicity of events. And the question was, where's the civic business leadership table to have the long-term climate conversations? Because if you look at the plan, it's clear that there are major changes that are transformational changes that will need to be made in the city's operating systems. And as the speakers have noted, most of those systems some of them are controlled by the city, but a lot of them are controlled by private and institutional players. So if we're not bringing that leadership along, there's no way we'll be able to make those changes. And it turned out that there just wasn't an organization in Boston that could serve that purpose back in 2010. So the mayor and Amos Hofstadter invited 34 people, 32 said yes, and we were off to the races. If you go to the next slide a little bit, in terms of our structure, as indicated, we have 36 CEO members. We have 4 sector working groups: higher education, healthcare, commercial real estate, and cultural institution. And the sector working groups give us an opportunity to engage a whole nother ring and network of players. So in most cases, we have 1 or 2 of the Green Ribbon Commission members who co-chair the working groups, and then the working groups will bring in the case of the cultural institutions, there are additional 38 cultural institutions who participate in that. So that enables us to really broaden our engagement. We have had periodic issue working groups, so we still have one on climate preparedness, we've had one on carbon neutrality, we've had one on transportation, and we're in the process of putting one together around climate justice. We have an executive committee of 8 to kind of lead the commission, and we have a development committee that works on our funding and fundraising. And just parenthetically, from a funding point of view, we have 26 of the 36 members that provide operating support, and that's where most of our operating support comes from. Our operating budget is somewhere in the order of about $1 million US a year, and then we're raising somewhere between $500,000 and $750,000 for specific projects. So the budget is somewhere between $1 to $2 million a year, depending on what kinds of projects we are working on. Next slide, please. So if you look back over the last 10 years, we've gone through a couple of cycles of engagement with this network. And we spent probably the first 3 to 4 years really making sure we had a really good shared understanding about climate and its impact and what needed to be done about it, its relationship to the economy, et cetera. Boston has great federal networks on climate action. We were able to bring in people like John Holdren, who was Obama's science advisor, and give us updates on science. So we spent a long time really getting this group educated about climate. When we invited them in, interestingly, we did not look for people who had a lot of experience with climate and climate action. What we looked for is leaders in their sector. So if they moved, the idea would be that other people would be moving with them. And then the next kind of phase that we moved into was really, and this is where the sector working groups are really important, sort of building sector leadership and a culture of best practice sharing. We refer to many of these organizations as first movers, and they're out front and they're ahead of the rest of the pack, so to speak. And we bring them together help them share best practices with each other, and help advance their own practices. And then we're entering another interesting phase now, which is you got an informed network. They know what sort of the state of the art is, and what the art of the possible is. And we're now using that network to drive policy change, both at the city scale and at the state scale. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So I think this is sort of the evolution. And then as the policy mandates get put in place, we can use the sector leadership best practice sharing as a way of helping folks understand how to comply with the policy. So if you move to the next slide, just a couple of quick examples of specifically where the Green Ribbon Commission has helped and supported the city and helped accelerate the city's work. One around renewable energy, one around resilience, and one around building performance standards. Next slide. So we put together a renewable energy purchasing network, and this was primarily higher education and healthcare institutions who are watching all these people do these really large power purchase agreements in other parts of the country and sort of saying, well, how come we're not doing this here? So we put together a network. We brought in consultants to support them. We did best practice sharing between them. We established a renewable energy leadership prize that we got foundation funding to support. And all of this activity, after about, I think it was 2 years of work, resulted in the largest multi-party virtual PPA at that time in the country, total of 60 megawatts. This was in 2016, and now has led to a really large number of these institutions going on and doing their own power purchase agreements. So this sort of built a practice area around power purchasing that hadn't existed, built an understanding within the institutions of what it took to do it, and built some capacities for them to execute on it. Next slide. So the next big, lift for us was around resilience and resilience planning. This is a picture of Boston with what they refer to as our wicked high tides, which is our king tides. And it's not sunny, but it's sort of what they refer to as sunny day flooding. There's no storm event. This is just a high tide, and this is one of the downtown wharfs. So a lot of the city is built on what they call made land, basically was fill. And when it was done back in the 1700s and 1800s, it was done with 1 foot of freeboard. And we're experiencing as the oceans rise, we're experiencing that now. Next slide. So this kind of, I think, a useful little example about how the commission's network really helped accelerate the city's work. So we have 2 large commercial real estate players on the Green Ribbon Commission. One is Boston Properties, and they're, I believe, the top Class A property developer and manager in the U.S., and Beacon Capital Partners. And both of them have very large holdings down in New York City. So in 2012, they went through the whole Hurricane Sandy experience and came back sort of quite urgently freaked out. One of them brought back pictures of fish swimming across his first story windows. And basically said, look, if a storm like that hits us here in Boston, we'd really be in trouble, and we need to radically accelerate our work on resilience. And so we as the commission ended up partnering with the city. We raised $1 million of capital to do all the research and analysis, and we hired a consultant to do it, HRNA, who had done the resilience work down in New York City, and we put a project team together, and that resulted in the city's resilience strategy called Climate Ready Boston, which then spawned a whole nother second round of projects. We now have resilience plans for the 5 most at-risk neighborhoods in the city. We looked at whether or not we should have a harbor barrier or not. The answer was no, by the way. We're in the city's in the process of implementing a flood overlay district as part of its zoning ordinance, which would require all new developments to be resilient to 40 inches of sea level rise. And we're starting to explore options for long-term resilience governance and finance structures. If you look at those 5 plans, we need to spend somewhere in the order of $2 to $4 billion over the next 3 decades to protect the city from sea level rise. And we don't have the structures and financing vehicles in place to do that, which is going to be one of our next areas of focus. Next slide. And then finally on building emission performance standards, sort of similar to the way that we worked with the Climate Ready Boston. The city asked us to put a working group together on carbon neutrality, which we did. And we raised, in this case, I think it was $1.3 million to do an analysis of the deep decarbonization pathways for the city, put it out in a series of reports called Carbon Free Boston. The city then took that analysis, and by the way, that analysis was done by one of our partner entities, Boston University, that sits on the Green Ribbon Commission, their Institute for Sustainable Energy. And the city took that analysis and used that analysis to inform their 2019 Climate Action Plan update that includes the sort of the strategies around deep decarbonization for the next 5 years. And 3 of them are related to policy mandates. And the first is to develop a carbon emission performance standard to decarbonize existing large buildings. We're just totally delighted because 3 weeks ago, that ordinance passed the city council with a unanimous vote. And so we now have in place, similar to the New York Local Law 97, we have an ordinance that requires all buildings that are 20,000 square feet or higher to meet emissions performance 5-year standards that get them to net zero by 2050, which is really a great accomplishment. We're in the process, in the second bullet, of actually putting a zero net carbon requirement for new development as part of the city's development approval process. And we are working quite actively at the level of the Commonwealth, since the building code in Massachusetts is controlled at the state level, to in fact get a zero net carbon stretch code option at the state level. So a couple, again, 3 examples of where having this network in place, having these relationships with these players in the various sectors allowed us to organize resources and organize stakeholders in ways that really move the city's agenda along. Last slide, please. So a couple of just, I think reflections on what has made this process work for us. It took a patient early funder, quite frankly. If we hadn't had the Barr Foundation, who was really our core funder at the front end, who was willing to put risk capital in, there's no way this would have been able to get off the ground. Now we have a very stable and very broad base of funders, but it took 5-6 years to get to the point where we could raise the capital from other players. So having an early patient funder, stick with a C-suite participants, don't have it turn into a staff group. It's really critical that this be sort of either CEO or EVP level players in these organizations, because peers like to interact with peers, and those folks can activate a lot of change in a city. We talked about a strong city partnership. These partnerships don't work if the city's not at the table and willing to both engage and act on things. We have to engage our sector leaders really closely and build relationships between them. There are an extraordinary number of the players on the Green Ribbon Commission that have been there for 10 years, and they have built relationships with each other that they didn't have before they got there, that now they find very useful for their overall kind of business strategy, which is the kind of last point is we work a lot to figure out how to connect climate action to the quote unquote day jobs of the CEOs. How, knowing about and acting on this, does this support your ongoing business strategy? So that's my last slide. Wanted to give you a quick overview. I want to say again how pleased we are with the relationship with C40 and their partners, because we're really interested in what other cities are doing this. Quick example, we have not historically focused a lot on making sure the members of the Green Ribbon Commission are in fact implementing climate action plans in their own organizations that are aligned with the city's targets. And we're starting to work on that. And a lot of this, the city business partnerships have started with that, which is organizations that have committed to certain kinds of standards and outcomes. So understanding how that's done is really useful to us, because I think that's going to be another phase of our work. So thank you, Kira, for the opportunity, and look forward to the Q&A.
And thank you so much, John. That was a wonderful presentation. And I think there's some really fantastic learnings in there for all cities and actually for all partnerships. So with that, we will come to Susan Alvarez, who's the Assistant Director of the Office of Environmental Quality and Sustainability in the city of Dallas, Texas.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. I'm not excited to follow John because he just gave a fabulous presentation on where Dallas aspires to be. So we are, I would say, taking baby steps, but they're big steps when you consider where Dallas is in the country. And I'm very proud to share some of the things that we've done this year and where we are along the path in the CBCA Alliance. Next slide. So in May of 2020, we passed a climate plan. Comprehensive Environmental and Climate Action Plan is the whole title. We call it CCAP because that is a lot easier to say than the whole mouthful. This was a month late. We wanted to do it on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. However, we also wanted to make sure that we had the opportunity for public input. And flashback a year, we were in the middle of a COVID shutdown. And so we delayed just to make sure people had a chance to look at it. Mayor Johnson has been very supportive of the city, but we have our marching orders. It's common sense stuff. They didn't want a pretty plan that sat on the shelf, and it's loaded. It really is comprehensive. Next slide, please. So the mayor's direction to my department and to a newly formed committee that he developed specifically to address environment and sustainability in Dallas, they wanted us to be a global leader. They wanted us to implement our CCAP. And then, like a lot of other cities, we have some areas that are redlined. We have some areas that have a disproportionate impact from prior land uses. And so we've also been directed to take a good look at environmental equity across the city and recommend cleanups, recommend changes to our codes, et cetera. So that's our marching orders, is to move forward to proactively implement environmental action along with sustainability across the city. Next slide. So makes a lot of sense. Cities lead the way, or have been in the last 5 years. We consume 66% plus or minus of the energy, create 66 plus or minus to 70 of the greenhouse gas emissions. Urban areas are growing. And the other thing that we've learned painfully from our own experience over the last 3 or 4 years is that when things go down, when you have tornadoes, when you have snowmageddons, when you have straight line wind events or flooding, it's the city leaders that are standing there holding the bag and that the residents look to clean things up, make it better quickly. And so it makes a whole lot of sense that cities are leading climate action across the country. We're one of about 475 different cities that belong to the U.S. climate mayors. And those are all cities that have pledged climate action. Next slide, please. So one of the things when we first started working on the plan, I'm a civil engineer from training. Our greatest risk is not coastal flooding, but inland flooding and straight line wind events. Since I'm a civil engineer, I'm not that familiar with buildings and energy. And so we started attending the meetings for the Dallas 2030 district, mainly so that we could learn what business in Dallas was already doing. For those of you that aren't familiar, the Dallas 2030 district network across the US pledges a 50% reduction in energy emissions, a 50% reduction in water use, and a 20% increase in alternative forms of transportation. So all of these goals of the 2030 district align perfectly with what the city is wanting to do. Next slide, please. What I found by joining 2030 is that most of our businesses were way ahead of where the city was, and we can certainly learn from our business. And we pulled them into the process to develop our plan. One of the other things that is critically important to our plan, we started looking, some cities do mitigation plans to reduce emissions. Some focus on adaptation. How do we manage those risks? How do we update our infrastructure? And some look at environmental quality. We started looking at related costs of mitigation and adaptation, and those nature-based solutions sure look really good, and they give us a lot of bang for the buck. So we have all three sectors in our plan. Every single action in the plan has had a full equity review, and we have 11 actions specifically addressing environmental justice. Next slide, please. So we've got 8 sector areas, and again, everything's got a measure, and I've got a huge database that we're using to track all of these things. But we do buildings. I say we have everything from A to Z. We have everything from air quality to zero waste, including buildings and energy, transportation, waste management, water management, and both food and urban environmental challenges. Next slide, please. And again, all kinds of metrics, 97 actions, which is a whole handful. And we're looking at co-benefits. Again, it's a huge breakdown of a lot of work. We finished this plan in May of 2020, right when everything was shut down and we didn't know when it was ever gonna open up. And my staff and I were looking at each other going, gosh, we need help. We need all the help we can get. Next slide. So we applied to be a cohort city with the CBCA Alliance because we felt like the business community kind of was already there and they were reaching out to find out how they could help us moving forward. And it was consistent with our direction from council, telling us they want to be a world leader and to share with other cities. Next slide, please. So one of the other things that we did for our council, they said, well, this is great, but how does it align with CCAP? So we went in and looked at the 6 sectors within the CBCA and lined them up with all of our 8 different things in our plan and found that the CBCA actually moves us forward in both the people category and the sustainable capitalism category, which helps our economic development folks. Next slide, please. So locally, we've been working on getting those partners pulled together. We've been participating in some of the sessions like this to share what we've learned so far. We've also pushed things forward with cities that aren't necessarily in the CDP or C40 yet, with letting them know what a great resource it is. Next slide, please. So where we are, we worked with our mayor to identify business organizations. We had a kickoff meeting a couple of months ago. The feedback has been very, very positive. A lot of these people were our original stakeholders and they're really excited to be able to move things forward. The challenge we had was the list I gave the mayor's office for invites had about 200 people on it, which is not a workable organization. And so it was a challenge to kind of hone it down to of 30 to 40, which is still a lot of people to get it kicked off. But so far, it's been very, very positive. We have a lot of people that are interested in working in this organization in Dallas. And to be quite frank, we're looking to Boston's experience as a really good template that could fit our business community here in Dallas. Next slide. So next steps, we're looking at what that governance model is. Who of the people that we talked to initially really are serious about taking this forward. And we're looking to launch our individual program later this fiscal year. Next slide, and I think that may be it for me. Yeah. So thank you for letting me share.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you so much for sharing your experience so far. And we look forward to working with you towards that launch coming up. So now we will hear from Reeves Taylor, who is an architect and the co-director of Design Resilience at Gensler.
Well, again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to a global audience. Boy, how to follow not only the big picture view from the former mayor of Toronto, a wonderful city, but two other amazing cities. Again, thank you, Susan, in particular, to shed light on Texas. Though Texas as a state kind of has a uncertain reputation, you can see our cities are really very much on top of that. I'll come to the end of my conversation to talk about the volunteer effort I'm part of with the City of Houston's Climate Action Plan. But what I was tasked to do, it was kind of put it in the context of, for a global firm that's all about public-private partnerships, the business partnership. I wanted to talk a little bit about what we see globally in that public-private partnership business. And so I've got a few slides to talk about, how we've been talking to business, not only to John's good point, to respond to a city moving forward with a regulatory reality, but in our own research institute, looking at where those impacted by climate change, either disaster. In fact, the Washington Post said 85% of across the world have been impacted by climate, just this morning's article. But also, what are we doing to try to get the longer term, if you will, action plan in place that you heard about already? So next slide. And so I come from an organization that is in fact very much about touching 50 offices across the globe. We've got recognition and working with businesses to find ways to map a climate action future. We have the top 100 clients, and almost 100% of those top 100 clients at their C-suite level have said, both in our own businesses, but in our partnerships with our communities that you can see where our offices are across the globe, we really need to make steps that way. And we've taken that very, very seriously in our own approach, in our own relationship with the business community in every one of our 50 office cities and beyond. Next slide. I think what's also important is, as part of a research institute, as well as engaged in actual progress in our projects, we're also connecting not only the business and public entities, but we're also recognizing the well-being, the climate impact on particularly communities of diversity and underserved economics. It really is a focus for us is to look at all three of the economic, the social, and the environmental implications that I think you've heard clearly in the presentations from Boston and Dallas, and really across the globe with this partnership. Next slide. What's also important is that in our research, in partnership with many of our colleagues, clients, et cetera, we need to see the balance of, what is the future of the city in this climate change, as well as the implications of equity and resilience, workplace, which has been our focus historically, and health. And so we see in this conversation what makes the business alignment work is recognizing in our 6 research focus areas in a firm-wide effort, really that balance of, it's not simply the heat or the straight line wind or the storm water, it's the implications across your business activities, the agility of your own firm to weather through it literally and figuratively, but also the larger community impact. Next slide. I think what's also important is that we believe that every one of our projects, every partnership with our business community is an opportunity for research to advance exactly what you've heard here. What are the implications of these shifts in perhaps regulation or frankly shifts in behavior? And so we really believe that design in the alignment with these necessary long-term challenges comes down to this kind of partnership. As colleagues have said over the last 20 years, this is the greatest design challenge the Homo sapiens species has faced, how to improve what we're doing in terms of our global impact and climate. Next slide. I think what's also important to note is that we feel very strongly that our intellectual property is not a competitive advantage we hold close to the chest, but really from our research, from our client partnerships that we show in a variety of publications. To us, the conversation that my colleagues have had earlier in this presentation is about transparency, communicating about how to get there together. Perhaps we compete with the best approach to certain kinds of projects, but we believe the knowledge that comes from climate insight, well-being in the workplace, response and recovery from pandemic is something that we need to share and move forward together. And that, again, becomes a very important component with both what CDP does, obviously, and what the World Business Council for Sustainable Development does. Propel knowledge sharing forward so that we can work together as a combined or unified industry, which for us is a very important component we're focusing on here in the next few weeks around the COP26. Next slide. And so we believe that it's now time, perhaps in coming back from a COVID challenge that even beforehand we were focusing on through our design process, 1.5 billion square feet alone of our own design within Gensler, but the impact of the built environment from making the buildings, the stuff, the operations of the buildings, as well as the implication on community well-being, biodiversity. We as architects, the owners of the buildings, the constructors that build the buildings have a very large impact. And we've often overlooked the implication on our communities that are underserved of diversity, of color, et cetera. And so we're now very much aware with the post-COVID world of how that well-being component is very much part of this through both our research and our design delivery. Next slide. And part of that design delivery is a planning approach I'll get to in a minute, but here's kind of the summary of our, what we call the Gensler Cities Climate Challenge, about which our co-CEO, next slide, spoke to the UN panel, plenary panel in 2019. Want to go to the next slide? I think I'm there. Yeah. And so basically, we almost 2 years ago clearly stated that our industry needs to take seriously the triple bottom line of the social, economic, and ecological dimensions that everyone on this call knows very well. But so the idea is that as an industry, not just one firm, but as an industry, we really need to move where we're working together. We're challenging in our Gensler cities. Again, the focus on what we've heard already and how important the North American and global cities are for the human population and future, if you will, civilization. But it's a challenge that we're not there yet, but we believe as an industrial group, as a builder, operator, user of the built environment that sits within the natural environment, we have to work collectively, which will be the message that one of my co-CEOs, Diane Hoskins, will be taking to the COP26 conversation in just around a month. Next slide. And so we believe that the strategies for livable cities, which I'm just going to touch on, which is our planning focus, really supports the business community, the public realm, our government agencies, next slide, in a very important way about how we shape the cities. And while I won't go through each one of these because our time is short, but just recognize what you even heard from the Boston focus from John and the Dallas focus from Susan. We believe regenerative urban environments that are connected to natural systems and inspired by nature. We look at the idea of reimagining the CBD, promote an inclusive and economically diverse city, and encourage technology to make those intelligent cities. And really all coming down to what it takes to have a livable and agile, if not resilient city in the future. These are our 9 points we bring to most of our large planning projects and influence every one of our design projects in those cities in an urban strategies mindset. Next slide. And so, a little bit more detail, but here again, the regenerative urban environment inspired by nature. Just going to touch on this, whether we're working in places like the Middle East, India, Greater China, Africa, and of course, North America and South America, LATAM, we really think that the conversation with the business community is very strong. The conversation with our public partners understands the very partnership that this session today is all about. And we're seeing more of that focusing around natural systems and learning from natural systems, even in something as simple as the design of a new neighborhood at the edge of a city. Hopefully not, if you will, displacing farming, not displacing agriculture, finding ways for urban agriculture as examples of this inspired by natural systems. And of course, how nature, being in Houston, responds to the challenges of hurricanes we're learning from, not just in terms of engineered resilience, that is flood barriers, but the community resilience that I think we're all very much focused on. Next slide. And so I've been privileged to be part of the Houston Climate Action Plan instituted by Mayor Turner over the last 6 years. We're not nearly as far along as the groups you just heard about in Boston and Dallas. We're learning from them. But Houston does have some notable successes. Right now, Houston is 100% in its city's energy needs, 100% renewable. Mayor Turner is the chair of the Climate Mayors Council. We have been part of both the Rockefeller 100 when it existed and the C40 cities. We've got a great connection with the state-sponsored PACE and other funding mechanisms. And so we've made a good start to create our plan, but now we're in the process of utilization of enforcement is not the right word, but kind of creating portable ways with our business community to make some positive change in what is the quote unquote old fashioned, but we hope the new energy capital of the world. Our Greater Houston Partnership, which is our analogy to the Better Business Bureau / Chamber of Commerce, is 100% a future of a decarbonized Houston. So there's a lot of alignment, but we're now moving toward the partnership with what I lead, which is building optimization, a real nature of how to build the bridges that we've heard from Boston and Dallas, and of course, Phoenix. And we've had many visitors from other cities that have made great progress. We're on the learning curve. And I think that's the business partnership and the public partnership in Houston is set. It's now time to see how we can activate in a lot of the ways that you've heard about today. Next slide. And so just the last couple of slides talk about our big focuses. Interestingly enough, the materials management, in terms of not only sewer components, but also solid waste is a big footprint for our city, and being a city known for its traffic congestion, energy transition as it relates to transportation is very, very important. And so it is a group of well over 200 some odd thinkers that range from citizenry to, yes, the inevitable policy and sort of politically aligned advocates, as well as engineers, architects, and community leaders of various sorts with real estate ownership or management. It really has been an impressively diverse organization, supported by our sustainability department within the mayor's department. I will say, as a quick aside, we've had a resilience plan that's with a separate group, and we're now seeing how these two can work together based on different supports and different components. We've had a number of the major energy companies from Shell and BP be large supporters of this effort, being again, major headquarters in our city. And yes, the energy companies I think are part of the challenge and part of the solution. So we are building bridges across the diversity of our, whether it's medical, energy, tech types across our city. Next slide. The next several slides we can go through, you can see what our goals are without diving into it. Mobility is clearly a very important component. The idea, of course, is to create something that's doable. Small steps count in our mind. It's not just regulatory, but also education, how to enhance not just in my case, the building optimization, the home users, but also those who operate perhaps the grade B buildings that proliferate on our edges, our suburbs, that, while the downtown skyscrapers are run by amazing teams who have already attained some amazing Energy Star recognition, it's time to really reach out to the diversity of the multifamily and office components that are perhaps 2 and 3 story owned by a local family. How do we change both the commercial realm and then more importantly, through a particular focus on urban equity, how do we help weatherize and educate the homeowners that of course represent the majority of our building, electricity, and natural gas use? Next slide. And as you can see, the building optimization, which I'm focusing on, you can understand the action plans going forward. Our time frame is clearly within the next 2 years, though, again, as a volunteer process, reaching across the diversity of Houston, it's taking the time that I think my colleagues, John and Susan, can share, what it takes to pull it together. Next slide. And here's some of the more detailed strategies. And what I'm sharing with you without going into detail is what is public available. This comes off the website, not nearly as nicely organized as Ravina was nice to organize, but the goal is transparency. There's not in the mayor's office for this particular process. It's really been from its inception. There's been some controversy about how it serves the entirety of our diverse community, and the mayor has responded to his credit, and his staff have been very much about transparency, and that's how it works in Houston. Next slide. And as you can see, that particularly the energy transition, working with our semi-deregulated energy deliverers, the electrification of our buildings comes first, but also, as I've mentioned, the city itself has gone to 100% renewable based. It's now time to move our grid that way in partnership with a variety of electricity generators and distributors. It's a bit of a challenge, but in fact is a terrific partnership that you can see already coming underway, with the Texas grid being at least 50% renewables at this stage, and Houston wants to take advantage of that. And of course, it also needs to be agile, as we learned with the infamous February snowmageddon, where the entire state lost power between one day and a week by virtue of the weather hit. Next slide. And once again, just understand the nature and the scale of partnership within who is, in each case, public-private partnership necessary to make some of these component targets possible to be there, both in terms of financing as well as education as examples. And again, we've had in partnership now with the Rocky Mountain Institute, the Houston Advanced Research Center, lots of investigation about kind of organizing by greenhouse gas impacts where we should target first, given perhaps how far behind we are in a lot of ways compared to some of our sister cities. Next slide. And as I mentioned, perhaps out of sequence, but the reduction of solid waste and liquid waste is a big focus because of its inordinate scale of our own city's energy investment. Moving water, cleaning water, and taking the water back and cleaning it again in our water systems with a very flat Houston actually takes the largest energy bite of the city of Houston as a city compared to most cities. With that energy focus needing to be clearly something the city itself can attack and reduce through a perhaps behavior shift of how we create the waste as citizens. Next slide. And with that, very much appreciate the quick overview of the public-private partnership and look forward to the conversation next. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Reeves, and thank you to all of our panelists so far. I'm going to ask you all now to please turn on your videos so we can have a conversation. It's nice to see you all. So for me, there was a few themes that were coming through all of your presentations. Really about choosing the right partners, making sure that we're choosing the right partners for the collaboration. Working also at the policy level and aggregating up to the state. Equity was something that everybody was mentioning and making sure that that was built into plans and partnership from the beginning. And then I also saw this theme of transparency and also trust. So those were the things that the connections that I saw that was linking all the presentations together. So I wanted just to start, John, with you to really talk about choosing the right partner. So you mentioned, when you first put out that invitation, I think, I don't know, you got 32 out of the 36. It was you went to a small number, got almost, very high participation. Susan's now in a similar position in Dallas where she's sending out invitations. She has to cut her list down. What is your advice there on how do you pick the right partners for this collaboration?
Well, yeah, thanks, Kira. I would just begin by saying, as they say, all politics are local. So it really depends on your local circumstance. In our instance, we did make a deliberate decision, sounded a little bit different than where Susan is moving. And we don't have any, trade association or advocacy groups other than Ceres, because Minnie Luber is located in Boston and she brings just an extraordinary reach, particularly around the financial sector, and chose instead to really zero in on people who own and control property and use energy. So that was just a choice we made because those are the folks who need to transform their systems. So we have Mass General Brigham. They're the largest employer in the state of Massachusetts, used to be Partners Healthcare, and they're the largest healthcare organization in the city. And we have folks like Harvard and MIT, and Boston Properties has 10 million square feet in the city of Boston. So we went after the very large property owners, was just and we figured if they're aligned, if they're not aligned, there's no way the city's going to hit their target. And if they are aligned, that will bring just a lot of other players along with us. I don't know if that's the right strategy, but that is the strategy that we had when we started. And I think it has tended to work pretty well with us. But interestingly, again, to Susan's mix of play, we are increasingly out building collaboration now with other network and advocacy organizations like the Environmental League of Massachusetts and Better City, et cetera. So we're starting to sort of bring some of those other players into the network, although they're not sitting on the Green Ribbon Commission.
Great, thank you so much, John. So Susan, I'm going to come to you now on equity. I thought you presented it so well. I love to see that it was embedded, right in the beginning in the plan, that every single action you did an equity check on. There were specific actions on environmental justice. Where did the focus on equity come from, and how did that become so centered in the plan? I think that's something that a lot of cities would want to emulate. Oh, you're on mute, Susan.
So overall, equity is key. A lot of the actions we're doing, the current city manager opened an office of equity and diversity. And so it's a citywide focus. That said, we did about 200 different meetings with the community in developing our plan, and we pretty much went anywhere people would have us. And then we got some help from local university students to go to some neighborhoods that really weren't comfortable with a government meeting or somebody from a government, what they really wanted. And so we worked with some of our local college students, but loud and clear, loud and clear word that you really need an equity focus. But it wasn't necessarily saying you need an equity focus. It was, well, the city of Dallas has not invested in my neighborhood for decades. Why is this going to be any different? And what are you going to do that's different? And that's a very, very valid criticism. And we listened and said, you know what, we really need to do this. Case in point, as we are implementing solar, we're focusing on community solar and addressing energy needs for those that are in energy poverty in the city first. Feeling that if we can get those folks taken care of, they have the most critical need and really the most benefit out of getting access to affordable clean energy. So that's an example, but that's carrying forward pretty much across the city and across our implementation.
Great, thank you, Susan. And we're very lucky that we have a youth advocate who's joined our group, and they've put a question in the chat, and I'll just read it. And the question is, to all the presenters in the process of preparing city action plans, have you considered youth voices and provided any youth sensitive goals or targets? So Susan, I'll come to you first. John,
the answer is,
Reeves, I'll come to you on Houston if you can speak for them.
The answer is a resounding yes. We went both to the Dallas Community College, to SMU, to all our local universities. We went to some high school environmental clubs. Actually, we had a member of the Sunrise Movement on our stakeholders group. And they very, very gently told us that our social media on the plan sucked, but then helped us figure out a way to take it forward in a way that met their expectations. So I would say that the youth voice was critically important. Getting a plan that reflected the whole of the city, not just people that go to planning. And the youth in Dallas were extremely helpful towards getting a good plan pulled together. I mean, they helped us reach some neighborhoods that the city would not have been otherwise able to reach.
Thanks, Susan. And Reeves, what about in Houston? How were youth engaged, and are there any youth-specific goals?
Well, we have a very large group of youth ambassadors that we have done, I think, a similar reach out to our primarily HISD, some of our community colleges. Kind of historically, the diversity that we're about has been their focus. In some ways, they've led the equity conversation perhaps better than some of our industrial or business partners. I think that's kind of key. They too are notably part of national and international organizations that they bring, I think, insight into other targets. You've mentioned, of course, the Danish groups that have been very helpful with a lot of the coastal cities in the United States. You know, that's something that has been brought up a couple of times by some of our STEM youth ambassadors who really have an interest in engineering, but they're not yet there, which is good because they can question us as opposed to the typical civil engineering approach that I know Susan referred to. Well, you know, Texas. It's about getting rid of the water from your property, and who knows where it goes afterwards, right? It's kind of thinking the big picture. The other interesting thing about our youth leaders is they're also in some ways representing the diversity of our communities much better in some ways, given the current status of professional life in Houston. And I think this is what's attracted particularly our energy companies to really see the value to this consensus building group. And as I said, with a separate resilience focus, combining the two has been a passion for the youth ambassadors that, again, I was just looking up to see how big the group is. It's now in the thousands, and we regularly engage them, I think, in our planning. Now it's time to re-engage them in our sort of implementation approach.
Wonderful. Thank you, Reeves. And John, do you want to comment on the same point?
Yeah. I actually wanted to just note that this really kind of highlights a strategic issue when you're putting city business climate alliances together, is you really need to be clear about what they're good for and what they're not good for, and we've been very explicit from the beginning that we represent primarily these large property owner segments, and community-based organizations, environmental justice organizations, engaging with youth, it's just like not our competence. And we've actually had a conversation with the city and said, look, should we be thinking as part of, a climate justice initiative of bringing on to the Green Ribbon Commission community-based organizations, environmental justice groups, CDCs, other kinds of players? And their answer and response was, no, you really, you should stick to what you're good for, good at, and just understand where your boundaries and where your limits are. So there's some of the things that need to get done on climate action in the city of Boston. We're not the right people to be leading on it, and we should be following other people's, suggestions. And we're totally happy to do that. We do have an active initiative right now on climate justice, but what we're doing is we're reaching out to the environmental justice groups to better understand what their agendas are and ask the question, how can the assets of our network come help support, your strategies and what you want to do? So I think again, to other folks who are putting these kinds of initiatives, stay in your lane, be clear about what you're good at, what you're not good at, and don't try to be, everything to everybody.
Thanks, John. That's a helpful perspective. And so, David Miller, I'm going to come back to you now and ask, as the former mayor of Toronto, how important do you think that mayoral leadership is in setting up the city business climate alliances?
I think it's extremely important from two perspectives. Going back to what John said in his remarks about having the C-suite at the table and how important it is if you're going to mobilize the business constituency to keep the business leaders at the table, and the best possible way to do that is for the mayor to be there. So I think the personal involvement of the mayor in a partnership and a collaboration like this really matters. And from a mayoral perspective, produces other benefits because you'll hear from business directly in the margins of these meetings about other issues. So it's helpful. I think in the bigger picture, a mayor is uniquely positioned to really drive climate action on behalf of a city. Partly because cities have many levers they can pull. In Boston's case, not just because I happen to know their work well, the mayor was instrumental in thinking about how to use parks as a way of adapting to sea level rise, and how to use city capital funding for parks to build new parks in low-income neighborhoods that needed better parks, but in the same way use them as a passive way of dealing with extreme flooding. And so the city has a lot of levers to pull. And for me, and I think we see this in Dallas through the leadership of two mayors, because the mayor is clearly responsible for the whole city, when the mayor gets in front of climate action, it brings everybody else on board. The city, institutions, business, government. So I think that mayoral leadership is critical, and it gives everybody a chance to be part of a citywide movement, and nobody else but a mayor is in a position to be that leader. So for me, it's critical, and also when the hand is well played, very effective.
Thank you, David. That's a great perspective on that from having been there yourself. So it's great to hear.
Hey, Kira, could I add just a quick thing to
please.
David's comments? One of the reasons the Green Ribbon Commission was put together was, in fact, to create continuity between mayors. And I just think this is a big strategic value of having one of these networks. So we've been through quite a few mayoral cycles, and we're in the middle of a mayoral cycle right now, and gubernatorial cycle. And in each instance, we have met with all of the final candidates before the election. And Marty Walsh, who's now Biden's labor secretary, would come to our meetings and he would joke. He says, I got so sick and tired of hearing about the Boston Green Ribbon Commission, but it's clear I need to pay attention to this. And he was a classic example of a mayor who didn't have, a quote unquote spear in his chest on climate. But the fact that there was this set of stakeholders who cared passionately about it and reminded him about it on a really regular basis, he became, as a co-chair of the North America for C40. He ended up taking a bunch of really, really aggressive leadership positions, on climate action, because it was clear to him that his stakeholders cared about it. So I think that's another advantage of having a network like this in place.
And John, I'm going to come back to you on one of the points you made earlier, and this is about working also at the state level, talking about how you could go, as the city and as a group of businesses to the state level to advocate for policy change. Do you want to just share a little bit more about that in regards to, I think you were talking about building codes? Yeah.
So I would say that this is a continuous tension, because our geographic focus is the city of Boston, and the city is our customer. But as all cities know, a lot of the systems that need to get changed are not controlled at the city scale. So what happens at the level of the state really matters. So we don't, Boston does not control its public transit system. It's run by the MBTA. It doesn't control the building code. If you look across the key areas, and they're driven by action at the level of the Commonwealth. But again, kind of knowing where your competency zone is and is not, we are not well set up to lobby aggressive, to sort of be a policy advocate in an aggressive kind of way. But and we have close relationships with the Commonwealth, and the EEA secretary, Katie Theoharides, sits on the Green Ribbon Commission, so we have very close connection there. So when they want a voice of the large, C&I sector, they generally will come to us, and we can organize it relatively quickly. And the city then also has, every year they build a legislative agenda, policy agenda, and so depending on what they have on that agenda list that is Commonwealth or state level organized, we will support them in making that happen.
Okay, great. And Reeves, from a perspective of a business, coming at this from the other side, what makes a good partnership with the city? What are you looking for that makes it worth it for you as a business to get involved, at a CEO level, and to commit to a partnership with what perhaps maybe your competitors in the partnership as well?
You've asked that question a couple of weeks back as we're preparing for this, and boy, I've been thinking about that a lot. Not being a CEO, but witnessing particularly the tech leaders, and those we see, on the headlines of shifting here, moving there, negotiating with cities, whether it be my hometown of Pittsburgh or Austin, Texas, et cetera. I mean, part of that shift is increasingly the conversation, as we're seeing with, Redfin's recent surveys about people choosing where to live based on climate challenges. Part of the conversation that the CEOs are having is a partnership not only to better understand what the city is facing and is trying to address, but also a collaborative partnership, with prediction, the Internet of Things. I mean, so many of the drivers of our businesses, what they're delivering is, how can we help to make it a more livable city that then allows us to recruit and retain the best and the brightest? So very often what drives the business conversation is clearly the tax issues and clearly service issues. And, invariably, are there incentives to relocate or grow? But increasingly what we're seeing, everything from how we're designing buildings, how we're designing the campuses, what and where you're choosing for those campuses and buildings to be. And we, by the way, design interior spaces for spec buildings. So it's down to, am I going to lease in a building, is driven by well-being, is driven by a perceived reality of, is there a long-term viability to be here? Driven by climate impacts, climate indirect impacts of perhaps, inequitable distribution of resources that we've heard, again, both by our Dallas and Boston examples. That's making a big decision matrix. That's part of the big decision overlay that our CEOs are making about location, growth, investment, et cetera. So that partnership of being honest and being part of a larger city's think, as David has talked about, as you've all talked about, is also important, that the city is not, if you will, closing their eyes to the reality. And this, by the way, whether it's a smaller but growing city in central Hill Country, Texas, or Knoxville in Tennessee, I mean, all cities are getting this transparency and communication. I think the only thing I might add in addition to that is also a recognition by the CEOs that it takes a community alignment, not just the public agencies, but other, to your point, Kira, what are the other corporations that are my neighbors doing? And it does engender a more collaborative approach, competitors or otherwise, that I think we're seeing, particularly at the upper levels, that recognition of partnership. I will say in the competitive, trenches, maybe there's sometimes some challenges there, and it takes a design team or some other teams to remind that it takes a unified approach in a community or an industry to make a difference with climate, to make a difference with these global shifts that in behavior and consumption. And I'm seeing more of that flexibility, even within the car world, the automotive world, even within the tech world, though there's, we are always very mindful of the silos of certain secret sauce we can't share, but the collaborative industries, even across industries with multiple cities, are recognizing lessons learned in one place should be brought to another city to advance everybody's cause.
That's great, Bruce. This thread of the lessons learned from one city going to another, I think is just absolutely key. I'm going to come to our last question, and this is, kind of touching on what you were talking about this location decision for people, where they want to live based on climate challenges. But I think increasingly people are also looking for jobs that align with their moral compass, and people are looking for green jobs. People are looking for jobs in the climate sector. So David, I'll come to you and ask, how important are these city business collaborations for the creation of green jobs in this kind of new climate economy?
I think it's extremely important. One of the biggest barriers to climate action is and will be the unwillingness of people who see themselves as losing in this transition to support the policies and necessary, and to support the politicians who are pushing those policies. And we've certainly seen that tension in a variety of elections all over the world. So in order for everybody to be able to support climate action, there's at least two groups that really need their needs directly addressed by climate plans and climate actions. The first are marginalized people living in low-income neighborhoods who need to be engaged in the planning and need to see the economic benefit coming to them. So projects like Blue LA, where electric cars are being made available at low cost by hourly rental in low-income neighborhoods, or where in Los Angeles they're training young people in low-income neighborhoods to have jobs as solar installers. So people are seeing that climate is benefiting them from an economic perspective, not just a health perspective. And the second group, of course, is workers in oil, coal, and other industries. And there are, odd examples. What about gas fitters who work on apartment buildings? What happens when you electrify all the apartment buildings? Those are really good unionized jobs. And you can't say to somebody, you got a really good unionized job, and now you're going to work minimum wage. You have to find a path. And I think it's critically important for all of us in our planning to think about at least those two groups, and there's probably more. And to me, business has a huge role here. How can we ensure businesses commit to decent work at a decent wage? How can businesses partner with the city to help create a pathway for these kinds of, I would call them modern jobs in green industries, and ensure that they're available for everybody, low-income neighborhoods, people from transition industries, and everybody else? And it's a tough question. Business has a critical role here, and I think by using these kinds of partnerships, we have a much better chance of answering that question.
Thank you, David. And I'm being told we need to wrap up. So I just wanted to say thank you to our wonderful panelists today. Thank you to everybody who also behind the scenes made this panel happen, who did a lot of work. If you're on the call, please just turn on your video and give us a wave while we say thank you to you. And the final thing I'd like to mention is that we are hosting 2 more sessions at the conference this week. They are Advancing Green Equitable Recovery in Cities on Wednesday, 13th of October, that's tomorrow at 9 o'clock Eastern Time, and cross-sector collaborations on addressing climate risk on Thursday, the 14th of October at 9:30 Eastern. So thank you so much, everybody who have done all the work behind the scenes. Thank you so much to our fantastic panelists. And thank you to our hosts, UN Habitat, the Global Covenant of Mayors, and the IBCC. Thank you so much, everybody.